Hey there, guys. As you know, sort of the places where I guess we could say the older people hang out tends to be the last refuge of those who don't fully agree with the sabermetric revolution. You'll find people who are willing to argue about the problems involved with war and things like that on places like Facebook, on Twitter. And I actually occasionally hear on YouTube as well. And recently on Twitter, there was another one of these debates about RBIs that came up. I mean, we can go through sort of the argument really quickly. Look, I mean, it's not hard to understand why people don't consider RBI to be like the ultimate offensive statistic. And I honestly don't think anybody's really trying to make that argument. That's a little bit far-fetched. Having said so, I do think that there's a good argument that there is such a thing as having the ability to drive a runner home, because if a guy can't do it, it really kind of stands out. And so there is a reason to feel, that players who are able to do this, might be players you want to respect a little bit. There are different things associated with that, of course, such as whether you have guys on base in front of you or not. And the example that we always come up with, as you know, is Hack Wilson. That's the one that everybody decides that they want to mention and want to brag about when it comes to whether RBIs are a thing or not. So I thought today, while I was reading as people were fighting back and forth about this, I thought it'd be interesting to look a little bit closer at Hack Wilson's RBI totals. Then I noticed something that's pretty interesting that you might not have noticed, actually. So we'll take a look at this and see. Those of you who know your baseball history well will already know this, but there are some of us who might not have PhDs in knowing everything about every single player. Hack Wilson, as you know, started with the Giants at 3 years in the early 20s. Stood out somewhat, and if you really believe in OPS, which I do, you like that 1924 season a lot, wound up going over to Chicago. That's where he really made a name for himself, right? 21 homers, 30, 31, then 39, and then, of course, 56. Led the league 3 times. You imagine leading the league with 21 home runs, and this is 26, so don't give me that dead ball era crap, right? But the thing that was most impressive is this is where the 100-plus RBI season started coming in. We know about 29 where he had 159, but the famous one is 1930 where he had 191 RBIs, walked 105 times, had a great eye, has this crazy 723 slugging percentage, a 1.177 OPS. I mean, these are like Barry Bonds style, video game statistics, man, just totally nuts. And then is his 1931 season, and that's kind of what we want to talk about here today. So if you'll remember a couple months ago, how fast time flies, it's crazy. We talked a little bit about Hack Wilson and looking at situational data from 1930, which showed us some real surprising things, such as with the bases loaded, he was, a paper tiger. Well, if you look at 1931, though, you start asking yourself what happened, right? Because you figure that the ability to drive somebody in is some sort of ability, like an actual innate ability, but maybe it's not. I mean, this is one of the most bizarre things I've ever seen, right? We go here, we look at 1930. This is his 1930 splits. If you want to know how to find this, you go up here to where are we? Well, you don't do whatever it is I'm doing here. You go to splits, and this is it right here, 1930 or 1931. It'll only give you batting splits because he wasn't a pitcher, and we don't have fielding splits, and we'll talk about that another day. 1930, I mean, he's hitting, I always still look straight at batting average. We can look at OPS. He has a 1.166 OPS with nobody on, 1.115 with people on. There's a good argument here that there's no difference between Hack Wilson with runners on base and Hack Wilson with the bases empty, right? I mean, he's just pounding the ball no matter what's happening, getting all sorts of walks, causing tons and tons of problems for opposing pitchers. I'm sorry, this is runners in scoring position. Here's runners on base, right? It's actually better, right? The OPS is better. Batting average, a little bit worse, but it's practically the same. I mean, this guy was just a complete monster. Now, here's one of the things you notice, right? RBI total with nobody on is the same as your home run total, so he had 22. But with men on, man, he had 164 RBIs. I mean, he just, cleaned up, especially with runners in scoring position. These days, you never see guys get 120 RBIs. He had that in 264 plate appearances, right? I mean, that's incredible. 121 runs batted in and 264 plate appearances. That's insane. It's just insane. These numbers are just out of this world, right? He had 121 runs batted in only 71 hits. That gets you an idea of what he was like, right? So yeah, this guy, I would say, had a knack for a while at getting the big hit. And then you look at 1931, and you start asking yourself who let the air out of the balloon, right? I mean, he didn't do so well with nobody on, 782 OPS, 256 batting average, 7 home runs. All of a sudden, with men on, he's only got 5 home runs, 49 RBIs out of his 48 hits, 261 batting average, 799 OPS, right? His OPS plus is not looking so good. This is the T or the S OPS plus, whatever. The whatever it is doesn't look as good as the other whatever it was did before. So you got to ask yourself, like, what's going on? My initial thought was, Hack Wilson must have been injured. That must have been what's going on, right? Because it looks like, he's not playing at full capacity. And so I sort of took a quick look over here at the Sabre biography to see if I could figure anything out. And yeah, he had a magical 1930 season. But had Wilson realized what the fates had decreed for him after his magical 1930 season, he might have had to stifle another sob or two. And part of the problem, interestingly enough, is that Joe McCarthy left the Cubs to be Yankee manager. Rogers Hornsby, who was a big hitter in his own right, suddenly was a new manager in Chicago. I would say St. Louis. He played in St. Louis. Who was Rogers Hornsby? He was an abstemious, stern disciplinarian who instituted curfews, weight controls, and tighter discipline at the plate on free-swinging sluggers like Wilson. Tighter discipline at the plate. Wait a second here. This guy, let's go back over here, right? This guy who walked 105 times, led the leagues in walks, who hit 356, 454 on base percentage, 1.177 on base OPS, right? One of the greatest single seasons by any hitter of all time. You wanted this guy to be reined in and not be a free swinger at the plate, right? He was everything that gregarious, hard-drinking, and partying Wilson was not, right? Let's see here. The two men couldn't stand each other, and it wasn't long before Hornsby brought the hammer down. So Hack had a bad spring. He started 31 slowly, was benched in May, and continued to be benched throughout the summer. And then he was relegated to basically nothing in August. And then a couple of weeks later, he was fined and suspended without pay for the rest of the season for not intervening while his teammate Pat Malone beat up 2 baseball riders in the train station. Well, I mean, I don't know if we can really blame Pat for that. Anyway, he ends up going to Brooklyn. And he also ends up getting a big pay cut. $7,500 is what his pay was. Wilson's story at the end is really, really sad. Because he ends up becoming a drifter in the 1930s. His marriage falls apart, and the bottom just comes out of this, and he ends up passing away in 1948. His body was in the mortuary for 3 days unclaimed. I mean, this is just crazy, right? And, I mean, I know there's a problem, right? He was a drinker. What do they call it? A teetotaler, and all this stuff, but man, who cares if he's a drinker? If he's putting up numbers like this, I go take him to the bar before the game, right? If he can do that, let's have more of that, right? Absolutely ridiculous, and it's absolutely sad to see that. This also makes me a little bit curious. So what we can do with Baseball Reference is we can look at the game logs for 1931 and sort of see what happened here. So we expand this, of course, all the way. And you can see, it's a slow start. It's the beginning of the season. There's no reason to really worry here. You can see that the hits are starting to come up. The slugging percentage is around the same. Have a couple of good games, a couple of bad games. But when we look here at the game number played, we skip from 24 to 26, and all of a sudden we skip down to 31, right? These aren't bad numbers, right? Just because he's not hitting 375 when you're 25 games into the season doesn't mean anything, right? He still has the ability to do this. If we want to look at this for the sake of comparison, you can tell that I probably should have actually prepared this ahead of time. We go over and look at his game logs for 1930. We can see here again is, what was that, 26 games in? Well, okay, he was hitting 356, 26 games in. But 18 games in, he was hitting 266, 373 on base percentage. He actually looks better here, right? 19 games in, he does. He looks like he's having a better year. So, okay, he has a slow start to the season, right? I mean, that's basically sort of randomization, This is what happens in baseball. You start messing with a man's playing time, and then he starts doubting himself, right? They messed with it here, then he can't get himself back up. And so what you do is you punish him again, you mess with it again. You go back here and you start messing with it a little bit more. He starts to pick it up, but it's not good enough, so you bench him again. and then you bench him again and again, and then next thing you know, I mean, the guy's not even starting games anymore, right? So he's still starting through late August. That biography was a little bit incorrect, but then in September, all of a sudden, he's relegated to a couple pinch hitting roles, and that's the end of it. This is the guy who set the record, 191 RBIs in 1930, and then 1931, can't get anything to happen. Anyway, there you go. One of the reasons why I wanted to do this is because you have to realize when we're talking about this stuff in baseball history, you have to realize that these players are not a bunch of numbers. They're not just a name. Like, these are actual people, and these are people who had feelings. They had their vices. They had the good side. You know, I know you think, oh, well, we really want to have good discipline, have a manager who controls everything. Well, sometimes you don't. Right? In this case, the Cubs probably didn't want that. They didn't play as well in 31. And part of the reason why is because their guy who was hitting the ball over the park and who was going and having a good time all the time, hit Harry Carey out on the field, right? You decided to tell him, you can't drink anymore, you're too out of shape and all this stuff. And then he can't hit anymore. And then to make matters worse, once he starts building it back up, guess what happens? You bench him. Right? Good job, Rogers Hornsby. Anyway, we could probably talk more about Rogers Hornsby being a jerk, but that's what really happened to Hack Wilson. So say what you want to about RBIs, right? Sometimes they flow freely, sometimes they don't. But the real story of Hack Wilson is not about these numbers and about whether RBIs is something that the batter can control or not. Well, clearly it is, because you can get a hit if someone's on base. All right. Now, the real story behind Hack Wilson is the story of a change in managers and a new manager who didn't want him to be himself. And if you don't feel yourself, if you're not starting, you're not going to produce. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. I'll talk with you again tomorrow. Bye.